All right, so if you were here a couple of weeks ago, we were going through the first part of what we call the Beatitudes. And Mark and I were talking earlier in the week that there was a series of books, or there have been a series of books written over the years that kind of go along with the very first description of this. We hear Beatitudes, and when you hear attitude, you think that it's something from the English. It is not from the English. It is, if you were to read a 5th century Latin translation of the Bible, it usually says about the condition of your heart and how you're acting. So if you'll notice, these things here are changes in the life of the person because of the work that God is doing by the Spirit. So we looked the last time at the ones that are mostly internal. So it begins with, if you'll notice, the poverty of spirit. That's the first one that's mentioned in verse 3. So blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Find elsewhere in the Scripture, in the New Testament, there is such a deficiency that a person would have that they're kind of reduced to begging, kind of on the street corner, handout, begging for something. But this is, in this case, spiritual. A person that comes to the understanding of their spiritual, what's being offered to them. And so in this case, as Jesus teaches us, let's remember again who his original audience is. So he's speaking now to multitudes. And the depravity or the problem that is happening with them spiritually is in accordance with the law. He's not speaking past the audience that's there to the church. He's speaking to the initial, and that was the children of Israel. They were the lost sheep, right? So as he's speaking to them, in order for them to correct their poverty of spirit, they were going to have to adhere to the law that God had given to them. This is the nation. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have application to us today, because of course it does. So understanding the original, again, there are a number of places that are kind of just these little tucks in canyons and whatnot, and they have this great acoustic quality to them. So you would be able to speak at a regular voice like this, and hundreds, if not thousands, could hear you. And the whole area around Galilee is kind of dotted up with these up in the north and the east and the west parts of the Sea of Galilee. So where it was exactly, we're not entirely sure. But if you read through what he has to say here, and actually this is all the Sermon on the Mount. This is Matthew 5 through 7. There are a number of things that he teaches here that are quite memorable to us. If you read through them, you might not stop to think, oh, that was said during the Sermon on the Mount. So that's the Lord's Prayer, the one that you get in chapter 6, and then the one that every person that doesn't really believe in God, but everybody knows that one. That's found in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, and they always forget about the rest of the chapter. It tells you to make a whole bunch of judgments about things like false teachers and a number of other things. They're meek. They have all these internal qualities. Eventually, those things are going to show outwardly. Now, that's the two that I have here that we'll look at today, and those are the last two that are mentioned. The only one that has any kind of description or elaboration that Jesus gives is when he says, blessed are you when you are persecuted. Happy or blessed at the idea of persecution. Seems almost kind of contradictory, doesn't it? How is it good to be persecuted? And so if you're the kind of people that are there listening to it, you might think, this is not what I signed up for. And oftentimes I think that the church sometimes does a bit of an injustice to the whole idea of being a believer by trying to tell you that from the moment that you get saved, everything is, your problems are over with and everything's going to work out just great. Well, in the eternal sense, I absolutely agree with that. You just don't know what's going to happen, from there on. Because look at the people who would have been the closest to him who heard these words. They were martyred for their faith because they were ultimately persecuted. When Jesus was talking to them in the upper room in chapter 16 of John, if you got over the course of the next few Wednesdays, not this one, but the next Wednesdays after that, we are taking a break on the Sundays, the Sunday evenings, up through the beginning of the year. But on Wednesday, after this one, before Thanksgiving, we'll do a few Wednesday nights, and we'll be looking at the places where Jesus says, I am the, and he has a series of 7 of them. In chapter 16, when he's up in the upper room with them, right before going off to Gethsemane, he begins that chapter by saying that the day is going to come, I paraphrase, when people will put you to death thinking that they offer to God a service. And then the end of that chapter, many of us probably know the passage, but he says, in this world you will have tribulation. I have overcome the world. In between those things, and again, put yourself in their place, and you're hearing this, this is not the way that we usually hear a relationship with Jesus taught in the church. It's always about, this is what's in it for you. Everything is you-centered. Unfortunately, that's not quite true, especially in some parts of the world. Because again, the guys that heard him say that in the upper room did not have a great next couple of decades for the ones who actually even survived that long. It was difficult for them. Now, what he ended up telling them in the middle part of that chapter is that he gave them then the promise of the Holy Spirit. So it's, in my absence, the Spirit will lead you in all truth. He'll be the one who will make known to you the things that I have said to you, and they'll be reminded of them. So it is with that much, much further in his ministry. This is in the earlier part of his ministry. This was shortly after calling all of his disciples to him. If you read at the end of chapter 4, he's going around and teaching in all the synagogues around Galilee. And then by the time that we get to this, the multitudes are gathering to him because people are getting healed. There's all kinds of supernatural things, and it's created quite a bit of interest. So that's where we pick up in these Beatitudes. What we're going to cover today is in verses 9 to 16. Let's just read them as a whole, and then we'll go back. So in verse 9 it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And then we have the similitudes, and I'll get to that when we get them, but let's just read through them. "You are the salt of the earth, but if a salt loses its flavor, how is it then to be seasoned? It is good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but they put it on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So let your light so shine before men that they would see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Practical, easy to follow, easy to understand. It's the last two that are mentioned here that they become very much outward, and it's why I kind of reserved them for today. Because if you're going to be a person that is seen as a peacemaker, or if you're going to be persecuted, that's going to be something that everyone will see. Now, if you're meek, as we heard in one of the earlier ones, meekness can be shown outwardly, but most people, when it comes to meekness, we think of people that are kind of gentle, they're a little bit easier going than your normal type of person. And not every case where I've seen that a person is meek as a believer, that they weren't already that way to begin with. Now, there's a meekness that is, of course, of a spiritual nature, because you kind of recognize who you are when you compare yourself to the God who loves you and saved you. That's going to affect you on the inward. But again, you can still have that. You might know people that are really very meek when you talk with them at church, but when you see them outside, they're not the ones standing on the street corner ringing the bell and telling people about Jesus. They're just kind of, there's more of a reserved, a gentleness to them. Again, nothing right or wrong about that. Not everyone's a street evangelist. God has a whole bunch of different ways that he ministers to people in the world, and so there's no cookie cutter. Those ones that we looked at again a couple of weeks ago. It's these last two that are really very, very interesting. And again, we have to remember the people that are hearing him for the first time and what it was like to live in that first century kind of a church. So the first one, I love this. It's the only place, peacemaker here, it's the only place that you'll find it in the New Testament. And even if you're reading a Greek transcribed Old Testament Hebrew, you won't find it there either. It's the only place in all of Scripture where this is used. So it's the first one, verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And here's again what you're going to notice. There's always that blessed are, whatever the description is, and then he has something to say after it, because he says here, they will be called the sons of God, or you'll be recognized, you'll be identified as his kids. So peacemakers. So the question would be, as far as people that are able to make peace, does it mean that you're able to resolve conflict between you and someone else? Or is it that you're kind of like the third party trying to work it out with people in the church? Does it mean that you're able to arbitrate and be the mediator among the unsaved and all that kind of stuff? It could work there, but the context is of a spiritual nature. So here's this really amazing way that you look at this, and how would this actually play, again, given the context. So whenever you hear about peace, for it, that means implied there's conflict. But if we're speaking about spiritual, who's the conflict between? Is it between us and someone else, or is it between the person that we're going to and the person that has that problem with God? Because that's what's being discussed here. If you're the person who is bringing peace, then who are the warring parties? The warring parties and the hostility is between God and the... So if we're going to be peacemakers, again, if we're these people who go in the name of the Lord, we have to be able to say what it is that God has done in us. We have peace with God, which we didn't have at one point, but the way for there to be a cessation of warfare is to come to the person who has the power, that being God. It's a losing battle. If you're going to make war, come to the point where peace is the only possible outcome, if that's what you desire, but you have to do it on his terms. So if you're able to say, I want to have peace with God, it's kind of like that when he talks with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and he tells him about being born again. And I don't know if you've ever read through that and thought, if Nicodemus was able to say, you've convinced me, so what do I need to do? Then Jesus would have said, well, the idea of being born again, it's not even possible yet. It's going to take him going to the life here on earth before that was even possible. So here Jesus, though he is not speaking past his audience, is speaking about things that can only be fully realized once he's completed his ministry. Pretty amazing when you hear this. So this idea of being the peacemaker, we are to go into this world. If we have the opportunity, as God would lay it out for us, and we get a chance to testify or be witnesses, we want to let them know, and we have our own personal experience. There was a time when I was alienated and separated from God, and yet he came into my life at his invitation to me. That invitation was accepted, and that was the beginning of all of this, to understand what peace was. Now, in Matthew chapter 10, there's a place there, some people might say, if you're kind of like Bible geeky and all the rest of it, and you go, there's that place where Jesus says, don't think that I... How do you reconcile those two things? Well, this is Thanksgiving week, right? So if you have a whole bunch of people over, especially those at the house that are unsaved, you want to bring down the temperature in the room, talk about Jesus. It will have quite the effect. He's like that name. You cannot speak it among the unbelievers, especially without that becoming uncomfortable. You can talk about him all day long with the church, and we're all on board. We're good with that. You start talking about him when it's unbelievers, and it's like, we don't talk religion and politics at Thanksgiving dinner. Well, I do. I don't know about you, but if that comes up, I'm okay with it. It's a good conversation, especially if it opens the door for you to be able to talk about the one who offers them peace. How cool is that? So, this idea of the peacemaker. How is then Jesus able to say, I've brought a sword? Well, if you want to know about the sword, he's talking about the division that'll happen even in your own household. So, if you want to find out how it is when Jesus brings a sword, you start talking to the unbelievers who don't want to hear it. It's going to divide. Now, if you want to talk about the peacemaker, the ones who will come to the Lord on his terms, they'll see what peace looks like. It's not going to be war. It's actually putting down all the implements of warfare. It's being reconciled. So here is the second one. And this is the only one. Isn't this interesting? It's the only one that he elaborates on. The idea of persecution. So I won't ask for a show of hands. Back home, I used to do this all the time at the church there in California. I'd ask for a show of hands. Nobody would ever do it. So I won't do it here. But if the day that you got saved, how many of you were told the day that you got saved, if you can remember what it was that really brought you to that point, was part of the message telling you, I can't guarantee you what it's going to be like. Actually, you're going to kind of be hated, maybe for some of the things that you believe. Also, by the way, found in, says you'll be hated by the world for my name's sake. And he says it a few different times. He says it in Matthew 24. He says it in his earthly ministry that identifying directly with him will cause the world to hate you. Did any of you hear that the day that you got saved? That's usually not part of the salvation message that you heard at church that day that you got saved, right? Well, it might not be the most comfortable thing. So here, Jesus wants them to understand, again, we're talking about the first century, and you can look at what happened to the people. who then were persecuted because of their identification with him. Now, here's an interesting guy. We don't have time to get to it today, but if you want a great example of this, think about who Paul was. We would have, at that time when he's being spoken about, Paul, same guy. He didn't get a name change. One is his Hebrew name, the other one is his Gentile name. He had both families. So Paulus, Paul, or if it's Saul, so we think, King Saul. That's the Hebrew of it. So same guy, didn't get a name change. It's not. So if you go through the book of Acts, by the time that you get to chapter 7, Stephen is put to death, right? First martyr of the church. By chapter 8, starting at the first verse, the church is being scattered. It was the beginning of what they know, what's known as the diaspora. They're going everywhere to get away from the persecution happening there. Chapter 9 is when Damascus. Why? Because of the persecution. To be persecuted means that you're put to flight. You're trying to get away. Now, we don't understand that. We think persecution is when somebody makes fun of you at work because you're a believer. That to us is persecution. Persecution, as they would understand it, means you go to another country and another capital to try to get away from what was happening in your own home area, your own home country, actually. So Saul being present at Stephen's death, chapter 7 of Acts, and the persecution becoming so thick that people leave, and then Saul, is on his way to Damascus to enslave and bring back, or to arrest and bring back those people who had fled away. He was, at that point, the persecutor. He was the one who put the people to flight. Enter Jesus, and then he's the one who is pushed from place to place. He makes his way to Athens and then ultimately to Corinth because he was trying to get away from the people that wanted to kill him from Thessalonica. So yeah, he saw it from both extremes, didn't he? Interesting fellow. So actually, we've joked around here. Some of the people, when we talk about it here at church, I know this is Texas. A lot of football fans in here, right? So we know that like at Super Bowl time, they always have the media day when everybody wants to ask questions of the players. And the big high-profile people, they have lines out the door to talk to them. And nobody wants to talk to a few of those other guys. They got nobody in front of them. That's going to be James, by the way, probably. Nobody wants to talk to him because they're going to look at him. You're the guy who's always telling me what a goof-up I was. I don't want to talk to you. But Paul's going to have a big line. So will David and a few other people, if you get the scenario. Maybe I should have just left that one alone. So the idea, again, of persecution. Look at what he says here. It's an interesting thing. This idea of having them be put to flight. He says this, blessed are those who are persecuted for what? For the sake of righteousness, or because of righteousness. Now, righteousness very simply means that it's what God would look at as far as our relationship to him being acceptable. Life-wise, the things that we do, when God looks at us, doesn't see us as perfect. He doesn't see us as sinless. He sees us as blameless, the word tells us. And he would look at us and say, they're in right standing with me. So here, the people that are persecuted because they're right with God, probably the easiest way for us to understand this. And it says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, where did we read that before? Verse 3, the very first one. So they're bookends in this. The very first one, blessed are those that are poor in spirit, because the promise is their inheritance of the kingdom of God. It will be given to them as inheritance. Same thing here. It comes full circle. It goes from the day that you were saved, making you then acceptable and right before God, to the point where so much has taken place in your life that you're willing to outwardly witness for who Jesus is, telling the people what it is that he's done in you. You've done that work of the peacemaker. They see in you that purity of heart and the meekness and all the other things that go along with it. The hunger and the thirst after righteousness. They see and they examine. Then at that point, especially as he's saying these things here, but the promise remains the same from the day that you stepped into your relationship with Jesus until the time when they might even want to put you to death because you're righteous as far as God is concerned. The promise is your inheritance of the kingdom of heaven. Mind-blowing, isn't it? Well, it is for me anyway, so I don't know about you guys, but I think it's pretty neat. Notice in the last two verses of this section, this is where he elaborates on this. So it says, blessed are you when they revile, when they persecute you, and they say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. To take his message to the world, it's going to get attention. Some people are going to be grateful for the things that you say. Some people, when they heard the prophets, were glad that God was communicating. Put them out is to either kill them or do whatever, but you have to silence them. Well, that's what had happened to so many of the prophets before. But look at the things that are said here in particular. Blessed are you when they revile you, and a reviling is that idea that there's just incredible malice. So they're going to do everything that they can in order to insult, to bring down. So the idea of reviling and then also persecuting is the same word that you have in verse 10, the putting to flight, the causing such fear because of malice and all the things that they're doing, they put you to the place of trying to escape, to get away. So blessed are you when they revile and they persecute you, and they say all kind of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. You can find there are times when Paul will write about this too, that people will say all kinds of things evil against you, trying to stir others up against you. The question is whether or not there's any evidence for it. In Paul's writings, it's usually more that they can say all these things, but there'll never be evidence for it. This is the idea of also giving false witness, all that kind of stuff. If you remember when Jesus was before Pilate, they stirred up a whole bunch of people to talk about all kinds of things. They did it with Paul as well, where they were going to say, well, this is what he said. And they were confused by the time that they got to give their testimony, and they were giving contradictory information. Because it wasn't about getting to the truth. It was about making a case. It was about trying to stir up the people against the person. Here, in Jesus' case, it would happen later in his life. It happened also with Paul. Well, maybe it very well could have happened to some of you in this room as well. But the idea that people will look at you and be so troubled by what it is that you say and what you testify, that the only thing that they can do by offering up resistance is make up a case. Find some way to dismiss the things that you have to say. Find a way to put you, if you will, to flight. These are the things: reviling you, saying things against you, having all kinds of slanderous things because of malice in their heart, insulting, those types of things. Again, if it ever happens to you, well, let me say it this way. If it's never happened to you, praise the Lord. But if it does happen to you, especially because you are vocal, just realize it comes with the territory. As though you're the first person that it's ever happened to. Here Jesus says, it happened to the prophets before. It did happen to him ultimately, and for the sake, or for the sake of righteousness, in this case, for the sake of your identifying with him. The two things are kind of synonymous, obviously. You're going to be right with God because you're right with him because of his son. Not hard for us to understand. So it says, what he says after this, it's adding to what he had promised in verse 10 about theirs being the kingdom of heaven. He says, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, I hope that this is never the motivation that we would ever try to look at, coming to the Lord because of what's in it for us. Again, I think that's an injustice that's been done throughout the church, and I think it gives kind of the false understanding of what it is to be a believer. Because again, we have no promises of what's liable to happen to us in this world. Again, we are so detached as far as this world is concerned from what it's like to be a believer in most of the rest of the world. Places where it's absolutely against the law will get you killed for an outward testimony. And yet, here again, what's the worst that we have? Each of you could probably think about it for yourself. What's the worst example of, quote, persecution that you've ever had to suffer for being a believer? Pretty minimal compared to what you get in most places, but for some very unusual circumstances. And the question that always gets asked about this, how long will it be until it starts to happen here? That's a question that I get asked all the time. But I don't know. There's not a good answer for that. How much God will have us see and how much will he allow before he returns is his knowledge and his alone. Now, verses 13 to 16 are known as the similitudes. And the similitudes are just a way of saying Jesus takes some earthly examples and applies them to the life of the believer. Things that they can see in the known world, things that they watch and observe every day. And so he says, you're kind of like this. You're similar to, similitude. These are words that we don't use. Beatitudes, similitudes. We don't use these kind of words. It's not our everyday English. But here he says it's very similar. Now let me just read those where he says in verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but if a salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled under the foot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set upon a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to the whole house. So let's take a look at just those. If you're the type that likes to look through commentaries and stuff like that and see what other gleaning can you do from what other people read in this. This is one of those passages that has about as many opinions of what is actually being said here as you could possibly get to. This is a great case where you can say, why don't we go with the most simple of easy to understand parts of this, ultimately does. Because I think we can get the idea of what it would be like if something was salty, and you would know that it's detectably salty, but then it's no longer salty. What's it useful for? Now, I love, myself personally, I love to cook. And in my pantry, I have a type of salt that it seems like you have to put twice as much of that stuff in as you do the other kind of salt, just to get the same kind of saltiness, I guess you could say. So if it gets to the point where you could take a whole handful of salt and it doesn't influence the flavor of the food that you're making at all, then what use is it? It might still be sodium and give you a heart attack, but it's not going to be salty. So why would you use it? What's it useful for? Well, it'll kill stuff. So if you throw it on grass, but here it says you put it out and it's to be trodden underfoot of men. Now, again, there are so many different ways that people look at this, and they complicate it. I think what the most obvious of things is to say, when it comes to the idea of salt, if salt is useful and it has a purpose, in this case, there are all kinds of, well, is it a preservative? Is it something that heals? That's, when you start to get into all those different ways that you can look at it, there's interesting parts of that, but it's, again, not what I want to get into this morning. We can just say, look, if something is salty but it's no longer salty, then what's the use of it? There's a uselessness to you. So again, all of those attributes that we've been studying about, if those things start to wane because of our own neglect, then you're just not as effective. That idea that, even if it's persecution and the things that he's elaborated on, if a person would say, I'm tired of persecution, I think I'll scale back a little bit. You're going to quit being salty. Now, people might, myself, that is not what's intended here. It's not about your own personality. It's about the effect that you have on the world around you. So, the first of these that he mentions, you're the salt of the earth. But if a salt loses its flavor, then how is it to be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled under the foot of men. That means just completely, it's of no use. You're not of any functional resource. Then he says this, you are the light of the world. If you go and study what Jesus says, and we'll look at this in a couple of weeks on Wednesday night, it's in the 8th chapter that Jesus talks about he being the light of the world, and that if a person will believe in him, they won't walk in darkness, but they'll have the light of life. So isn't this an interesting thing that he's saying that you are what I also who he is? If he's the one who brings light into darkness, man, we're supposed to do the same thing. Our message is the light. It's not about us. It's not about personality. It's not about any of those things. If you will testify carefully about what God has done in your life around unbelievers, it's like a light switch is just put on. Now, whether or not they're going to like it, or they'll be like, the types of little the kinds of pests that go running when light gets turned on. I don't want to call them cockroaches. That seems so mean. But we get the picture. There's times when lights get turned on and people do not like it. So we've watched it. I'll tell you this, honestly, there was a time when I was one of them. And that time ended a long time ago. But you were probably, I don't know, nobody's born. This is something that is a conscious decision that comes down the road. And you may very well, like I, were resistant for who knows how long, until finally it was, I'm convinced. Again, it was because and then he uses, again, in a similitude, it's like this. You're the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. This is one of the things that I love to do when we're in Israel. And we love to get up in the morning at sunrise, and you can see the sun coming up over what are known, you hear it in the news all the time, the Golan Heights. And if it's in the morning, right before the sun comes up, then everything that you can see of the mountains that are there are all in shadow. They're all silhouetted. There's nothing that's built up on the hill, but you can tell where there's little settlements where it's dark. You can tell that there's something there. You cannot hide. And there are other places that you'll get to in Israel and everywhere, same thing. You put something on the top of a hill, and it's not like you're doing it to be stealthy. You're actually, think about it this way. We came from California. We escaped, I'll just be honest. So the people who have the greatest amount of wealth and whatnot, they're the people who love to put their houses right up on the hill. That's the prime location, and they make sure it's lit up pretty well so that people know it. It's able to be seen. Well, in the proper way here, same thing. If you are going to be as that city that's placed upon a hill, there's nowhere to hide. As believers, we're not supposed to. As believers, we're supposed to be the light to the world. It can't be hidden. He goes on with that same illustration where he says, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a stand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. And again, lights would be usually these just little ceramic, they look like little lamps, I guess, genie type lamps, but they're just made of earthenware, and they have oil in them. And they would have wicks, and you would light them like we would think any kind of a lamp that burns oil or high, and it just tends to illuminate that much more. This is, again, all of what he's trying to say. It's living in such a way that outwardly people notice, they recognize. So he ends up ending it with this section here. He says, so let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, the things that are produced in your life, the fruit. And what will they do? So that they can glorify you. No, they'll glorify your Father who's in heaven. It is for him to get the attention, not you. So I've said this, and I know that Mark shares this as far as we're concerned. If there's ever anything that you hear from the pulpit here that just resonates with you and it really goes down deep and it just has that effect on you, you might remember hearing it or some road, and you don't remember who it was that said it, but it just resonated. It just had such an effect on you. I know for myself, and again, I know I can speak for Mark in this. We don't care if you remember that you heard it from us. That does not matter to us in the least. What we are pleased with is to know that it resonated with you and that it changed your life, because we're just the people who are the guys that sit up here and do these kinds of things, these studies, and looks through the word with you. We're participants along in this with you. So if there's anything that's of any usefulness, it's because the Lord's done the work anyway. We're just the mouthpieces, and we're incidental. It doesn't matter. We're all that way, because again, our lives are just for whatever length of time we have them. We're here and we're gone. What he does, it's enduring. It lasts forever. Remember, we're reading from a book that is at its its latest writing is still 2,000 years ago. So it's not like we've come up with something brand new. We're said, again, by the one who makes all of this possible. He's the one teaching these things. And they had to be somewhat oblivious. We are not. We can't be. The word is complete, and we have this relationship with the Holy Spirit who makes these things known. So, amazing Beatitudes. Let's stand.